Hey there, fellow night owl. Before you cozy up under the covers or settle in for some background comfort noise, let's take a walk. No, a muddy, soul-breaking trudge through the grimy, gritty, gloriously unfair world of medieval Europe. Forget the castles, the princesses, and the slow-motion horse rides into sunset. This was a time when life expectancy was the length of a bad haircut. Your neighbor was just as likely to be a witch as a tax informant, and bathing was considered suspicious behavior. So light a candle, mute the real world, and let your mind slip back to a time when toothaches could kill you. Work started before dawn, and the most exciting part of your day might be not dying of hay fever. And hey, if you enjoy being emotionally wounded by history while trying to fall asleep, don't forget to subscribe. I make this journey regularly, and there's always room on this rickety hay cart of existential dread. Let's get into it. Let's say you wake up in a medieval European village around the year 1263. Not in a castle, not in a monastery, in a hut that leaks when the weather sneezes and rattles when someone 3 streets over yawns too loud. You don't have a name yet. That's okay. Names are optional when you're the 5th child of a pig herder and a bread maker, both of whom have never used a spoon that wasn't carved from firewood. You're born into the laboring class, which is a fancy way of saying you don't get to sit down, you don't get to dream, innovate, or rise above. The church says your lot in life is a divine choice. That's cute. You're 8 and you already have back pain. Your job is to haul, harvest, dig, and die, in that order. And do it all while smiling through a mouthful of wooden teeth if you're lucky enough to still have a jaw. You don't get school. You get stories told by your uncle who smells like fermented cabbage and once claimed he fought a dragon, which was probably just an angry goose. Education, that's for monks, nuns, and the mayor's 3rd son who will never use it but gets a robe anyway. Your day starts before the sun, not in a romantic sunrise meditation kind of way. No. You get yanked from sleep by your mother yelling about the missing goat and the fact that the roof collapsed again under the weight of last night's fog. Your blanket is a woven mat, your pillow is a sack of barley, and your room has no windows because windows are wealthy sorcery. You wash your face in a bucket of yesterday's rainwater, the same one your brother just sneezed into. Soap? That's a luxury. You clean yourself with ash and hope. Teeth? Scraped with a pine twig. Hygiene is less about cleanliness and more about not actively horrifying your neighbor's ox. Your first meal? A crust of bread so hard you need an apology from God to bite into it. If you're lucky, you get a smear of something resembling cheese. If not, it's just hard silence with a side of boiled nothing. You eat quietly. Speaking during meals is frowned upon unless you're asking someone to pass the bowl of old onion broth that has been reheated since last harvest. The village itself is one long stretch of worn mud paths, huts made of wattle and daub, and livestock with more personal freedom than you. The mayor lives in a slightly bigger hut, with a chimney that works most of the time, and walls that don't cry when it rains. Your home smells like smoke, mildew, and the perpetual disappointment of feudal economics. Now work. You head out into the fields with a hand-me-down hoe and a hope that this year's harvest won't be as tragic as the last. Your task? Turn over dirt for 6 hours, pause to drink from a shared gourd, then repeat until you can no longer feel your legs or your will to live. Your boots are made from stitched leather scraps, passed down from someone who died of scurvy. Your shirt has so many patches it's now technically a quilt. And your pants? You don't really want to know what they're made of. Let's talk social mobility. There isn't any. You can't change your status. You can't just start a business or follow your passion. If you told someone you wanted to become a traveling bard, they'd ask what village that disease came from. Your job is inherited. If your father was a thatcher, you're a thatcher. If your mother cleaned chamber pots, guess what you're doing on Saturday? And speaking of chamber pots, and there's no indoor plumbing, you relieve yourself in a wooden bowl with a handle, then toss the contents into the street, preferably yelling, "Look out," but not always. Streets reek. The scent of raw humanity mixed with livestock leavings is so potent you could bottle it and use it as a punishment. Women, by the way, are on an even shorter leash. Your destiny is marriage, childbirth, bread baking, and praying your husband doesn't die in a barley accident. You're expected to be silent, fertile, and invisible. You marry by 13, Have your first child by 15, and your second child before you're legally allowed to not be blamed for the weather. Let's say you're the village cobbler. Sounds fancy, right? Wrong. You spend your life repairing shoes for people who pay with eggs or promises. If you're really unfortunate, you get called crafty, which is just medieval for definitely a witch. And religion? Oh, it's everywhere. The local priest has more say over your fate than the king. He decides who marries, who's cursed, and who gets buried near the church versus the creepy tree on the hill. You tithe. Always. Even if your pantry is emptier than your future. Entertainment? Once a month, a traveling juggler might roll into town. People lose their minds over someone balancing rocks on a stick. Music is whatever your neighbor can hum while hitting a barrel. Dancing is fine, but not too much, lest the priest accuse you of inviting the devil to your knees. And if you ever try to question any of this, say you wonder aloud why you can't own land, or why the baron gets to hunt deer while your family eats boiled nettles. Congratulations, you are now suspicious, maybe even possessed. Best case, people avoid you. Worst case, you're tied to a tree until the fever passes or you stop breathing. So yes, life in a medieval village is romantic. If you romanticize joint pain, zero rights, and a daily schedule that involves don't die before supper. You exist to serve the land, pay the church, avoid bandits, and possibly be mistaken for a demonic spirit if you sneeze too loud during Mass. Still feeling nostalgic for the simple life? You wouldn't last until lunch. Imagine the sun barely cresting over the horizon, casting a pale light over the thatched roofs of your village. The rooster's crow isn't just a quaint alarm, it's the signal that your day of toil has begun. You rise from your straw-filled mattress, the remnants of sleep clinging to your weary body. There's no time to stretch or yawn luxuriously. The fields await, and the Lord's expectations are as unyielding as the soil you'll till. Your first task is to stoke the embers in the hearth, coaxing a small flame to life to warm the meager breakfast. Perhaps a thin porridge made from barley or oats. There's no sugar to sweeten it, no fruits to garnish it. Just the bland sustenance to fuel your labor. You eat quickly, mindful of the chores piling up like the firewood you chopped yesterday. Stepping outside, the chill of the morning air bites at your exposed skin. Your garments, coarse and patched, offer little protection. The village is already stirring. Fellow peasants shuffle towards the fields, tools in hand, faces set in grim determination. There's a silent camaraderie in your shared hardship, a mutual understanding that complaining won't lighten the load. The fields stretch out before you, a patchwork of browns and greens, each plot a testament to the relentless cycle of planting and harvesting. You take your place, gripping your hoe with calloused hands, and begin the back-breaking work of turning the earth. The sun climbs higher, its warmth a double-edged sword, comforting yet oppressive as the hours drag on. Midday brings a brief respite. You gather with others under the sparse shade of a tree, sharing a simple meal. Perhaps some bread, a piece of cheese if fortune smiles upon you, and a sip of ale brewed weak enough for even children to drink. Conversations are sparse, often revolving around the weather, the crops, or the latest edicts from the manor. As the sun begins its descent, you return to your labor, muscles aching, sweat mingling with the dirt on your skin. There's no room for slacking. The overseer's watchful eye ensures productivity. Any lapse could mean punishment or a reduction in your already meager rations. Evening finally arrives and you trudge back to your dwelling, every step a reminder of the day's exertions. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of smoke and unwashed bodies. You share the space with your family and perhaps some livestock, the latter brought in for protection against thieves and wild animals. Dinner is similar to breakfast, simple, unadorned, and just enough to stave off hunger. Afterward, you might engage in small tasks, mending clothes, sharpening tools, or tending to the animals. There's little time for leisure, and even less energy. As darkness envelops the village, you collapse onto your mattress, exhaustion pulling you into a restless sleep, only to repeat the cycle with the next dawn. Now let's talk about hygiene, or more accurately, the tragic absence of it. In your medieval village, staying clean isn't just difficult, it's considered odd, suspicious even. If someone bathes too often, People start whispering. Maybe they're hiding something. Maybe they're a sorcerer. Or worse, French. Cleanliness wasn't exactly synonymous with virtue. If anything, it made you look like you had too much time on your hands, and that was already enough to put you on the priest's watch list. Bathing, when it happened, wasn't a candlelit spa session. There were no lavender oils, no pumice stones, no fluffy towels. A bath usually consisted of a wooden tub filled with barely warmed water, the same water the rest of your family would bathe in after you, in order of social rank and smelliness. By the time the last child got in, it was less a bath and more a soup of communal regrets and hair. But even these group baths were rare. In truth, most villagers didn't bathe more than a few times per year. Special occasions included religious holidays, harvest festivals, and the ever-popular, "I stepped in something I can't identify, and now the cow won't come near me," emergency scrub. For everyday cleaning, you used a cloth, a basin of cold water, and some scrubbing powder made from crushed herbs, old bread, or ash. Yes, ash. The logic? If it can clean a fire, it can clean your armpits. Spoiler, it cannot. Your hair, if you had any left after a childhood of lice and questionable herbal treatments, was washed irregularly and often trimmed with a knife that also doubled as a chicken gutting tool. There were no shampoos. If you were lucky, someone in your village knew how to make lye soap, which was either too soft to matter or so caustic it stripped the first layer of your personality. Teeth? Ah, those crumbling pebbles in your face. Dental hygiene wasn't a concept so much as a series of desperate superstitions. Some villagers used twigs to pick at their teeth, believing that rubbing them with mint leaves or salt would prevent rot. It didn't. By the time you reached 33, a ripe old age, your smile looked like a graveyard after a mild earthquake. Cavities weren't fixed. They were excavated with iron tools, no anesthesia, and a strong local boy to hold your arms down. And then there was the issue of waste disposal. In theory, you were supposed to walk to the designated dumping pit outside the village walls, a sludgy crater filled with centuries of shame. In practice, most people just used a chamber pot and flung its contents into the street with a quick shout of, "Beware below," which often came half a second too late. That's right. The streets were rivers of slop, human and animal, and you walked through them daily, with open-toed shoes if you were unlucky, or barefoot if you were really unlucky, which you probably were. Diseases. They were basically neighbors. You knew their names, their habits, and their victims. Dysentery, typhoid, and skin boils were just part of village life. Sick days weren't a thing. You worked unless you were dead. And even then, someone would probably ask you to finish your turnip duties before being respectfully dragged to the burial pit. But let's say, miraculously, you weren't currently bleeding out of your gums or covered in mystery pustules. You still had the social grooming expectations of your class to contend with. A peasant was expected to look humble and practical. No frills, no jewelry, no style. If your tunic didn't look like it had been trampled by a cartload of pigs, you were probably showing off. Even wearing colored fabric was sometimes frowned upon. Dye cost money, and if you were wearing bright green or blue, people might assume you'd stolen it. And theft in a village where everyone knew your name meant quick judgment and public punishment. And speaking of grooming, women had it even tougher. A woman's appearance had to walk a tightrope between virtue and suspicion. Hair was often worn covered, braided or pinned in painful styles that mimicked the nobility, but with significantly more splinters. Nails were kept short, not for beauty, but because long nails meant laziness. And makeup? Only ladies of high status, or people accused of devil worship, dared to wear even a hint of color. Rouge was scandalous. Scented oils were practically a sin. And shaving anything? Only the clergy did that, and even then only the top of their heads. But don't think the upper classes had it easier. Oh no, they were just better at hiding their filth behind expensive perfumes and lace collars. A noble might go months without bathing but mask the stench with rose water and imported spices crushed into powders. In other words, same dirt, fancier disguise. Their bedsheets were silk, yes, but they were also washed once per season, usually by a servant with nose damage and a short life expectancy. Public health? That's generous. The village healer, if one existed, was usually an old woman with a garden full of weeds and a personal relationship with mold. Her cures involved things like fermented goose fat, rabbit droppings, and prayers to obscure saints. If you had a fever, you were bled. If you had a rash, you were wrapped in cheesecloth. If you had a headache, you were told to stop thinking so much. Death was usually the only effective medicine. Occasionally, a traveling doctor would appear. He carried tools that looked more like torture devices than instruments of healing, and claimed to be educated in the humors, which were bodily fluids that needed balancing. This balancing often involved leech application, enemas, and purging, which is exactly as fun as it sounds. You paid for this experience with eggs or bread, or in one case, a daughter's hand in marriage. He left as quickly as he came, often with a trail of new funerals behind him. And through all this, your goal was simple. Don't die in a way that makes your neighbors uncomfortable. If you could remain upright, mostly clothed and not covered in sores during Sunday service, you were doing well. Appearance was less about attraction and more about reassuring others that you weren't actively contagious. Because in this time, no one expected you to be clean. They just expected you to not be noticeably decaying. And that's a high bar for a society that thought soap was suspicious and believed sneezing too often was a sign of spiritual corruption. So no, you didn't smell great. Your teeth looked like a medieval dungeon. Your clothes were designed for survival, not fashion. And your body was a living museum of injuries, infections, and bad decisions. But if you could keep your head down, scrub yourself once per season, and avoid dying in public, you were considered a respectable member of society. Think you could survive even a week in that world? With no toothpaste, no private bathroom, and no concept of clean as we understand it? You might reconsider the next time your water heater breaks or the Wi-Fi goes out for 10 minutes. Let's talk about food, or rather, let's talk about the brutal, humbling reality of what passed for food in your medieval village. You might think that living on a farm surrounded by animals and crops meant a feast at every table. You'd be wrong, dangerously wrong. This is not the land of abundance. It's the land of rationed misery, and every bite you eat is part of a delicate equation that balances hunger with taxes, superstition, and the occasional barn fire. Let's start with breakfast, which isn't a meal so much as a whispered apology from the universe. It usually consists of a crust of yesterday's bread, if any remains, or a watery porridge made from oats that have been boiled to the consistency of regret. If you're extremely fortunate, there may be a turnip involved. Not a cooked one, just present. Maybe sitting next to the bowl like a passive-aggressive garnish. There is no butter. There is no sugar. There is only the faint hope that today's work won't burn more calories than you can replace before the sun goes down. Lunch is slightly more substantial, mostly because it's the only real meal of the day, and also because it needs to carry you through another 6 hours of digging trenches, hauling firewood, and pretending that your lower back isn't trying to secede from your body. You might get some vegetable stew, which sounds appealing until you realize that it's just boiled cabbage with a single carrot floating in it, like a lonely survivor from a better meal. Meat is a luxury reserved for festivals, noble houses, or the accidental death of a pig. If an animal dies, you eat it quickly and without questions, even if it died mysteriously, especially if it died mysteriously. Dinner? Dinner is a repeat of breakfast, only now the bread is harder, the porridge is colder, and the turnip is definitely staring at you. You eat by candlelight, not for ambiance, but because the sun has gone down and your home has one window, and it's just a hole stuffed with straw. Conversations over meals are short. You don't chat. You chew quietly and try not to choke because there's no one around certified to save you. And let's get one thing clear. You eat last. If you're part of a large household, maybe a farming family with grandparents, siblings, and a few tenants, the pecking order is set in stone. The eldest male eats first, then the eldest female, then the children in descending order of usefulness. You're somewhere between the dog and the guest nobody invited. If you're a servant, or worse, a distant cousin staying over, you get whatever's left, which might be a bowl of broth and the opportunity to listen to someone else enjoy chewing something crunchy. Meals are seasonal, Not because it's trendy or eco-friendly, but because you have no choice. In winter, your pantry is a shrine to root vegetables and dried legumes. Potatoes? Not introduced yet. Tomatoes? Poison, according to some. Spices? A fantasy unless you're wealthy, in which case you use cloves and cinnamon to mask the taste of meat that's been dead longer than your grandfather. In spring, it's greens, dandelions, nettles, and any leafy thing that hasn't been peed on by goats. Summer brings hope, beans, onions, peas. Autumn is the best. Apples, grains, a chicken if you're rich or have blackmail material. But winter is just survival with seasoning, and by seasoning we mean salt if you're lucky, ash if you're not. Drinks? You don't get coffee. You don't get tea. You don't even get clean water half the time. Water comes from a well that's also suspiciously close to where your neighbor dumps his slop bucket. So instead, you drink weak ale, made in small batches at home, and just alcoholic enough to kill some bacteria, but not enough to help you forget the taste. Children drink it too. There are no age restrictions when the alternative is intestinal roulette. If you're part of a richer household, you might get wine, sharp, sour, and sometimes spiced with herbs to make it slightly less awful. Let's pause and visit the nobleman's table. Picture it. A long wooden hall, roaring fires, tapestries of questionable historical accuracy. The baron sits at the head of the table, surrounded by family, friends, priests, and sycophants. His meal is the stuff of legend. Roasted game, spiced pies, stuffed pheasants with their feathers reattached for decorative flair. His bread is white, made from refined flour that peasants couldn't afford even if they mortgaged their grandchildren. His wine comes from the south. His dessert is sweetened with imported honey or preserved fruit soaked in syrup. This is the peak of feasting. But it comes at a cost. Every bite is a performance. You must praise the cook, thank the Lord, bow when the priest passes gas, and pretend not to notice the rats in the rafters. The food is good. The politics are exhausting. Meanwhile, back in your hut, you scrape the bottom of your bowl with a piece of bread so hard it could double as a building material. You save every crumb. Waste nothing. Ever. Leftovers are breakfast. Bones become soup. Soup becomes stew. Stew becomes something unidentifiable that lives at the back of the hearth until a brave soul decides to eat it or dares it to fight. Fasting days? Oh, there are many. The church calendar demands over 100 days a year of limited eating, where meat, dairy, and joy are banned. On these days you eat fish, but you don't live near the coast. So your fish is salted, dried, and older than some of your siblings. Sometimes it's not fish at all, it's bew. It's beaver tail or swan, animals the clergy have deemed fish adjacent for loophole reasons. You chew with your eyes closed and your soul full of doubt. And let's not forget food as punishment. Steal a loaf of bread? You're flogged publicly and denied rations for a week. Fail to pay your grain tax? Your family is fed last. Complain about the flavor? Congratulations, you now eat standing outside with the dogs. Food is survival, but also control. The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh, and sometimes the Lord just sends his steward to remind you that your cow belongs to him now. Occasionally, festivals bring a reprieve. Harvest feasts, saints' days, weddings, rare chances to eat until your stomach protests. You drink too much ale, dance poorly, and consume dishes that feature actual spices, maybe even eggs. But it doesn't last. The next morning, you're back to the same bowl of mush, trying to remember what meat tastes like while your neighbor loudly regrets marrying a woman who can't cook gruel without burning it. Children? They eat what they're given. Babies are nursed if the mother is healthy enough, otherwise goat milk or gruel. Toddlers chew on bread soaked in broth. If a child gets a treat, maybe an apple, maybe a spoon of honey, they remember it for months. Candy doesn't exist. Sugar is mythical. Joy is limited to berries you're not allergic to, and the one time a traveling merchant dropped a fig near the market. And if you're a woman, don't expect to be served first or second, or at all if you're unmarried and seen as a burden. Cooking is your duty. Eating is conditional. You prepare the food, serve the family, then eat what's left. You clean the pots with sand and tears. You boil bones until the marrow gives up. You bake bread in a stone oven that works once every 3 attempts. And you do it again. Every day. Without applause. Without rest. So yes, food is life. Barely. It's the fuel that lets you survive one more day of labor. It's the glue of community, the bribe for obedience, and the illusion of control. You don't eat to thrive. You eat to not collapse. You eat to avoid punishment. You eat to remember what it feels like to not be hungry, even for a moment. Still hungry for a taste of the past? Let's say you've made it through another grueling day of toil, blisters, and bland stew. You're lying on your straw mat, drifting towards sleep when someone pounds on your door. It's not a friendly knock. It's the kind that rattles your ribs. Outside stands the Reeve, the Lord's hand-picked enforcer, flanked by 2 village men with faces that haven't smiled since the last comet. Your crime? A pig went missing. Not your pig, but a pig. And someone said they saw you walking near the field where it used to be. That's all it takes. Welcome to the medieval justice system. You're already guilty. The only question now is how creatively you'll be punished. You don't get a lawyer. You don't get a fair trial. You get hauled in front of the manorial court, a crude bench set up in the Lord's Hall or sometimes right in the middle of the village square. The judge is likely the Lord himself, or maybe a bailiff who got the job because he once read a page of Latin without fainting. Evidence irrelevant, witnesses optional. What matters is who's accusing you, how well they're liked, and whether your family has recently annoyed anyone with status. The legal system is a delicate balancing act of power, superstition, and wildly inconsistent customs. One village might demand a fine. Another might demand an ear. If the crime involves livestock, it's treated more seriously than if you just slapped a neighbor. Animals are property. Humans, questionable investments at best. Let's say you're found guilty. The punishments are swift and highly theatrical. For petty theft, you might get put in the stocks, those lovely wooden devices that clamp your head and hands, turning you into public entertainment for the afternoon. Children throw rotten turnips, adults mutter curses. Some people just stare silently while chewing on bread and judging your family name. Repeat offenders don't get second chances. They get scars. Branding with hot irons is a favorite pastime of local sheriffs, especially on market days. Thieves might be marked with a T. Liars might get the tip of their tongue cut off. Poetic justice in a world where poetry is mostly about saints catching fire. If you're lucky, the punishment ends with bruises. If not, you're about to lose something. A hand, a toe, your home, or your spot in the community. Worse still are the punishments for crimes against authority. Talking back to the Reeve? That's not sass. That's sedition. Spilling ale on the Lord Steward? That's practically treason. And treason is always dealt with harshly. You might be whipped in the square. You might be fined 3 months' worth of barley. Or in more dramatic cases, you'll be tied to a cart and dragged through town until the crowd stops throwing things out of boredom. And don't think for a second you can run. There's no start fresh in a new village fantasy. If you try to flee your community without permission, you're branded an outlaw. That means anyone, anywhere can legally harm you without consequence. In some regions, even helping an outlaw is punishable. So you'll starve in the woods, hunted not just by wolves, but by bored teenage boys with pointy sticks and something to prove. But surely the church was more merciful, right? No. Church courts were just as terrifying, only quieter. Whispered accusations of heresy could send your entire family into a spiral of suspicion. Did your cousin say something weird during Mass? Did your sister read too well? Did someone hear you laugh during a funeral? Suddenly, a friar is knocking at your door asking questions about your beliefs, your books, and whether you've been consorting with the local apothecary who's already halfway accused of witchcraft. In religious trials, you don't need hard proof. You just need fear, and there's plenty to go around. If the church decides you need to be tested, you might face the infamous trial by ordeal. There are several versions, all equally fun. Trial by water involves being bound and thrown into a river, float, and you're guilty, because water rejects evil. Sink, and you're innocent, but also dead. Trial by fire means holding a red-hot iron bar and walking 3 paces. If your wound heals within 3 days, you're innocent. If not, too bad. Also, you might now have only half a hand. Then there's the oath system. If accused, you can try to clear your name by assembling a group of oath helpers, people who swear you're a decent human being. But they have to be respected. If your only friends are drunkards and the village fool, you're out of luck. And if one of them stutters or forgets the script, congratulations. You're now legally suspicious and probably in for a whipping. But what if you're accused of something truly serious? Something like witchcraft, blasphemy, or meddling in noble affairs. Now you're in real trouble. You might be locked in a cell with rats and straw, interrogated under duress, or encouraged to confess, with tools that look like gardening equipment but cause lifelong trauma. If you don't talk, you're defiant. If you do, well, now you're a confirmed heretic. Either way, the result is usually the same: execution, exile, or being forced to beg barefoot for forgiveness in front of a crowd while covered in soot and shame. Punishments were also gendered. Men got flogged, mutilated, or pressed into forced labor. Women, they were often shamed publicly, paraded through town in rags, forced to wear humiliating symbols, accused of causing storms, failed crops, or male impotence. In many places, a woman who spoke too confidently was seen as dangerous. Outspoken? A witch? Educated? A demon? Too quiet? Also a witch, just a sneakier one. You couldn't win. Children weren't exempt either. If you were old enough to carry a bucket, you were old enough to be punished. A 10-year-old who stole bread might be beaten or lose an ear. A teenager caught spreading rumors could be locked in a cage and dunked in the river for hours to wash out the lies. Childhood was not a shield. It was barely an excuse. And the laws themselves? They changed. Constantly, a law in one village might not apply 10 miles away. What's legal on Monday might be banned on Tuesday. And many laws existed solely to benefit the nobility. For example, if a peasant poached a deer from the lord's forest, it was a capital offense. But if the lord's horse trampled a peasant's entire barley field, the official verdict was, "Don't stand so close to the road next time." Worse still was the humiliation aspect. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about making you suffer publicly so others wouldn't get ideas. Crimes were read aloud. Confessions were shouted by the accused. In some towns, special shame horns were blown before floggings. In others, a convicted person had to wear a sign or even a mask depicting their crime. Imagine being forced to wear a wooden pig snout because someone thought you cheated at dice. That was your life now, until the priest said otherwise or the crowd got bored. So no, there was no true justice in the medieval world, not for commoners. The law served those who made it, twisted by wealth, fear, and centuries of tradition designed to keep the powerless firmly on the ground. And while some crimes were real, most were just excuses to reinforce the status quo, to silence dissent and to remind everyone watching that obedience was safer than truth. Next time you grumble about jury duty or a parking ticket, just remember, at least no one's measuring your soul with boiling oil or threatening your livestock over a missing crust of bread. In modern times, we're fed stories where love conquers all. The star-crossed couple defies expectations, battles fate, and kisses under the stars while violins play in the background. In a medieval village, however, if you kiss someone under the stars, you're either married to them already, about to be flogged, or accidentally interrupting a fertility ritual that you are now legally part of. Welcome to the complicated, joy-starved labyrinth of medieval relationships, where feelings are secondary, and status, duty, and breeding capacity are the real metrics of attraction. Let's start with the basics. You don't marry for love. You marry for grain, or goats, or a plot of land just slightly less cursed than the one you grew up on. Marriages are arranged, often by parents, priests, or the village elder whose matchmaking qualifications include knowing everyone's medical history and whether their family has angered any local spirits recently. If you're a man, your wife is chosen based on her dowry, fertility potential, and ability to bake bread without bursting into tears. If you're a woman, your husband is selected for his livestock count, number of teeth, and general survivability. Courtship, as we understand it today, is non-existent. There are no candlelit dinners, no romantic strolls. The closest thing to a date is both parties showing up to the same funeral and not insulting each other's family. If a boy brings a girl a flower, it's likely because his mother told him to, or because he's been dared by his friends and wants to impress them more than her. If a girl makes eye contact for longer than 2 seconds, tongues will wag, reputations will fray, and some nosy aunt will already be stitching a wedding shirt before the week is out. If you're a peasant, your wedding ceremony is a short affair held in the chapel or out on the village green. The priest says a few Latin words, most of which nobody understands. You hold hands, promise not to die before planting season, and boom, you're married. You get a slice of sour bread, a cup of watery ale, and the immense pressure of producing offspring before your spouse starts questioning your usefulness. There's no honeymoon. There's just a shared bed, shared chores, and shared disappointment when the goat escapes again. But marriage isn't the end of your emotional journey. It's the beginning of your assigned partnership contract, one where love might bloom over time, or might not. Most couples coexist, bound more by shared hardship than passion. Intimacy is functional, private, and rarely discussed. Compliments are rare. Gifts are practical. A sharpened sickle, a sturdier pair of shoes, or not insulting your in-laws for a whole week. And if you argue, you do it quietly because the walls are thin, and gossip moves faster than the plague. Women in medieval society are at a distinct disadvantage when it comes to romance. They have little to no say in who they marry. They're expected to be obedient, silent, fertile, and endlessly accommodating. A wife who expresses opinions is difficult. One who seeks affection is foolish. And one who refuses her husband's advances, that's a serious offense. In many villages, spousal consent wasn't even a concept. The marriage contract implied perpetual access, whether she agreed or not. Domestic abuse was rarely acknowledged, let alone punished. If a man hit his wife, it was seen as discipline, assuming it didn't leave her unable to work. If she hit back, that was scandalous, unnatural. Proof of witchcraft, maybe. At best, she'd be publicly shamed. At worst, she might be locked away or sent to a convent if someone wanted to hide the embarrassment. Divorce? Practically unheard of. Separation might occur if one partner was taken by the church, became mentally unwell, or simply vanished during a storm. But legally, marriage was for life, and often that life was short and miserable. Children were the primary goal of marriage, not for joy or companionship, but as labor, lineage, and insurance. A childless couple was a suspicious one. Maybe they'd angered a saint. Maybe the woman was barren. Maybe the man was cursed. Either way, whispers would begin, and the priest might recommend extra prayer, more alms, or sleeping in the barn to please the fertility spirits. If children were born, they were raised as tiny workers. Love was there, quietly, roughly, but the main goal was survival. Teach them to walk, talk, and carry water before they're 5. That's love, medieval style. Adultery existed, of course. The world is still the world, after all. But the consequences were enormous and deeply uneven. If a woman was caught in an affair, she faced disgrace, expulsion, or execution, depending on how badly her partner or the local lord took it. She might be shorn, paraded through the streets, or locked in a hut until her shame faded. Men, on the other hand, often got away with little more than a stern warning, unless they slept with someone else's wife, in which case the punishment involved a knife, a priest, and a long, loud ceremony involving forgiveness and minor blood loss. Romance did exist, rarely, secretly, and always with a healthy side of tragedy. A farmhand might fall for a shepherd girl. A baker's daughter might trade glances with the thatcher's apprentice, but these stories usually ended poorly. One was married off to someone else. The other moved away. Or worse, the romance bloomed, was discovered, and both parties were punished for defying tradition. In a few whispered cases, forbidden couples ran off together. They either died in the woods or were hunted down and dragged back, not for justice, but for community stability. The only people allowed to experience romantic love were the bards, traveling musicians, storytellers, poets. Their songs were filled with yearning, heartbreak, and flowery metaphors about moons, rivers, and long hair. But even they knew their place. They sang about love they didn't expect to live it. And if one of them actually fell in love with a noble's daughter, well, the next song was probably written from a jail cell or with broken fingers. And let's not forget same-sex relationships. They existed quietly under layers of fear and code words. Two women might help each other through hard times. Two men might share a roof out of economic necessity. Publicly, nothing happened. Privately, hearts broke, desires burned, and lives were navigated with painful caution. If discovered, punishment ranged from forced penance to public torture, or being sent to fight in some war far away, never to return. Love in any form that defied the prescribed order was dangerous, daring, and almost always doomed. So no, this wasn't a world for soulmates. Love letters were rare, and when they did exist, they were intercepted by curious relatives or passed along by maids who charged a loaf of bread for the risk. Public displays of affection were scandalous. Holding hands was acceptable only between children or very old couples. And kissing? Only in private, after marriage, or during ceremonies designed to cement political alliances. Romance wasn't about emotion, it was about timing, survival, and not being seen. In a society built on obligation, loyalty, and inheritance, the idea of love as we know it, free, expressive, joyful, was mostly confined to songs, legends, and stories told around the fire by people who knew better. They knew the difference between what could be imagined and what could actually be lived. And still they told those stories. Because even in a world where affection was risky and marriage was a contract, the heart found ways to dream. However quietly, however foolishly, however briefly. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a perfect morning in your medieval village. Crisp air, golden light trickling through the treetops, and the scent of freshly turned soil in the breeze. It sounds idyllic, right? Now imagine that same breeze turning into a wind strong enough to rip the roof from your home, that golden light blotted out by clouds that spit ice instead of rain, and that soil washed away overnight by an unexpected flood. Nature, in medieval times, wasn't your friend. It wasn't your garden, your canvas, or your peace. It was a relentless, untamable tyrant, and you lived beneath its moods like a flea on a lion's back, tolerated at best, but always a moment away from being crushed. Life in the village was tethered completely to the seasons. Every crop you planted, every animal you bred, every bundle of herbs you harvested had a time and a place in the year's natural rhythm. But that rhythm wasn't predictable. It wasn't a gentle cycle. It was a swinging pendulum, and sometimes it came with teeth. Spring was supposed to be the season of rebirth, of thawing earth and blossoming hope. But just as often, it brought sudden floods, storms that shattered trees and soaked fields, and the return of pests that devoured your young crops like they held a grudge. Summer? It could be kind. Long days, warmer air, growth in the fields. But with summer came droughts, weeks of blistering heat that turned your soil into cracked stone and your cattle into walking skeletons. Wells dried up. The river shrank to a lazy trickle. And the flies? They multiplied with such enthusiasm that stepping outside felt like walking into a biblical plague. And if you thought staying inside was safe, good luck. Thatched roofs retained heat like ovens, turning your home into a smoky sauna filled with sweat, soot, and the sounds of someone coughing in the next room. Maybe from the heat, maybe from the fever that always seemed to arrive with August. Autumn, of course, was the season everyone pinned their survival on. The harvest had to be good. Had to. If your barley was too thin, if your apples had worms, if your root vegetables rotted in the ground because the rain came too early or too late, winter would kill you. Not might. Would. Autumn was frantic. Men worked from dawn to dusk. Women preserved, salted, dried, and stored every scrap of edible matter in cellars and clay jars. You prayed. Hard. Because no matter how much you prepared, nature could undo it in a single night. And then, winter. Beautiful, silent, and utterly merciless. The snow blanketed the world in stillness, but underneath it was starvation, sickness, and the slow erosion of hope. Your breath hung in the air like a ghost. Your fingers cracked from the cold. The fire had to be fed constantly, and firewood was often damp, smoky, or simply gone. The old people in your village would say, "Winter is when the land remembers what it owes." And every year it collected, in fevers, in frostbite, in empty stomachs. If your food ran out, you boiled leather. If your firewood ran out, you burned that broken stool no one had sat on since the last famine. And if a neighbor died, well, sometimes people didn't ask too many questions about how the soup pot stayed full. But nature's fury wasn't limited to the seasons. Oh no, disaster struck when it wanted, without notice, without reason. Lightning could set your barn ablaze. A single ember could torch half the village, especially when everyone lived so close together that one sneeze could start a pandemic, and one spark could ignite a generational tragedy. Rain could be gentle, or it could turn your road into a sludge pit, your garden into a swamp, and your livestock pen into an accidental graveyard. And then came the winds. Real, howling, soul-snatching winds that shook homes and stripped trees bare. Some villagers believed the wind carried spirits, curses, omens. If you heard it whisper your name, best not to mention it. Best to tie a charm to the doorframe, salt the window ledges, and stay very, very quiet. Because in a world without weather alerts or storm tracking, superstition was all you had. And nature loved a mystery. Fires were terrifyingly common. With homes made of wood, straw, and wishful thinking, one misstep could reduce everything to ash. A knocked-over candle, a cooking pot left too long, a spark from the blacksmith's forge carried by the breeze. Once, an entire village disappeared overnight. All it took was a dry week, a careless child, and no well within reach. People didn't even scream. They just stood and watched, because they knew there was no fighting it. No water buckets, no fire breaks, just loss. Even earthquakes happened. Not as commonly as in other parts of the world, but when they did, they were devastating. Whole sections of land shifted, churches cracked, wells collapsed, and the people, already trembling from fear of sin, simply saw it as divine punishment. The earth had spoken, repent, rebuild, resume planting, because you had no time to mourn. The cows still needed milking, and of course, there was disease. Nature's quietest killer, not just plagues that swept through towns like wildfire, but the constant quiet threat of bad water, spoiled food, or a rat bite gone wrong. One day you're tending turnips. The next, you're hallucinating in bed, sweating through your only blanket while the local healer mutters prayers over a bowl of steaming nettles. Disease wasn't treated. It was endured, and sometimes that meant isolating the sick in barns or watching them be carried off to death huts at the edge of the woods. Crude shelters where the feverish went to either recover or not. Animals weren't spared. A disease that wiped out half the village's sheep meant no wool, no milk, no meat, no income. A strange mold on the grain, ergot, though you wouldn't know the name, caused seizures, hallucinations, and even death. Entire families lost their minds, flailing and moaning through fields while neighbors whispered about possession, witches, or divine fury. But in all of this, the most terrifying part was not the drama. It was the normalcy. These weren't one-off catastrophes. They were regular occurrences. You lived with them, worked through them, buried your neighbors, and kept sowing seeds. Nature to you wasn't something to be conquered. It was something to be survived. Sometimes it was beautiful. The way mist rolled over the hills in the early morning, or the way a gentle rain washed the filth from the village paths. But that beauty always came with teeth, with warnings, with consequences. And so you adapted. You built your roof a little steeper this time. You planted your cabbages a little earlier. You taught your children not to stand near trees during storms, not to drink from still water, not to mock the wind. You passed down charms, rituals, and stories. Stories of angry rivers, vengeful forests, talking wolves, and lakes that swallowed entire carts. Because in a world without certainty, stories were shields, and sometimes belief was the only defense you had. Still think you'd survive a year in a medieval village? Even if you had tools, skills, and luck on your side, all it takes is one freak storm, one bad winter, one misjudged harvest, and suddenly, the land turns on you. And it doesn't apologize, it doesn't care, it just keeps going. You don't conquer nature in this world, you submit to it, respect it, pray to it, and above all, fear it. You can't talk about life in a medieval village without talking about the single most powerful force in the known world, the church. Not just as a building, not just as a priest, but as a total, all-consuming authority that dictated when you woke, how you spoke, who you married, what you ate, and exactly how long you were supposed to feel guilty for enjoying anything at all. Religion wasn't just a belief system. It was law, science, entertainment, government, and therapy, all wrapped in Latin phrases you didn't understand but feared deeply. From the moment you were born, your life was placed in God's hands, literally. Baptism happened within days, not because it was celebratory, but because infant mortality was so high that skipping it could mean a soul forever lost to limbo. The priest mumbled holy words while your mother wept, and your father wondered if he'd have to bury another child before winter. The entire village watched, not out of joy, but out of obligation, and because every new soul was another name added to the church rolls. One more tithe, one more body for festivals, one more mouth to remind of sin. You were raised in fear, not fear of punishment, but fear of eternal damnation, which frankly made most village punishments look like playground games. The church made it very clear, everything you did, thought, or felt was observed by God. There was no privacy, no secrets. Lust was sin, pride was sin, envy was sin, and if you ever so much as dreamed about hitting your neighbor for stealing your firewood, congratulations. You'd better repent before a storm drowns your pigs, and everyone blames you for it. Sunday was not a day of rest. It was a day of mandatory anxiety. You dressed in your least filthy tunic, brushed the hay from your hair, and joined the rest of the village in a chapel that smelled like wet wood and desperation. You stood through sermons that droned on for hours, filled with threats of hell, stories of saints who died horribly, and long warnings against dancing, drinking, or laughing too much on feast days. The priest was often the only person in the village who could read. That gave him unimaginable power. He decided what scriptures meant. He interpreted dreams. He listened to confessions. He settled arguments. He told you how many candles to light and how many coins to drop in the collection plate if you wanted your soul to stay inside your body another week. Confession was terrifying. You didn't go in lightly. You rehearsed your sins in your head like an actor before a stage performance. Lie about bread? Think unholy thoughts during a funeral? Steal from the granary? You whispered these to the priest behind a curtain, sweating like a man preparing for his own hanging. Sometimes the priest would simply give you penance. Say 3 prayers, fast for a day, maybe help clean the cemetery. Other times he'd stare in silence and you'd walk away with your stomach in knots, knowing he'd be watching you during Mass to see if you squirmed. And penance didn't stop at prayers. It could involve flagellation, public apology, or wearing signs around your neck that labeled you as a sinner, not that everyone didn't already know. Word traveled faster than truth, and sometimes the punishment wasn't physical at all. Sometimes you were just denied communion, denied burial in sacred ground, denied the priest's blessing before childbirth or a dangerous journey. And that denial carried more weight than any sword. It meant you were spiritually alone, cut off, vulnerable. Superstition was folded into religion like herbs into stew, inseparable, flavorful, and occasionally poisonous. People believed in curses, omens, and signs from heaven. A black cat crossing the path wasn't a joke, it was a bad harvest. A sudden wind during a funeral meant the soul had been taken by demons. Dreams mattered. Sneezes were signs. A shadow falling the wrong way during Mass might mean a hidden sin had gone unpunished and now the village would suffer a drought. You didn't question it, you acted on it. You salted doorways, tied holy symbols into your child's hair, and whispered prayers to obscure saints whose names you couldn't pronounce but feared dearly. And then there were relics. tiny bone fragments from long-dead saints, pieces of cloth that supposedly touched the Virgin Mary, teeth, nails, sandals. Every village dreamed of housing a relic. It brought visitors, donations, prestige. But relics were expensive, so naturally, they were also counterfeit. Half the holy bones being paraded around Europe probably belonged to pigs, and the priests knew it. But faith doesn't need proof. It needs only desperation and hope, both of which the medieval world had in generous supply. Pilgrimages were a big deal. Not everyone could make one, but if you did, it was the spiritual equivalent of leveling up. People walked for weeks, to Canterbury, to Santiago, to the Holy Land if they were mad and rich. They slept in ditches, prayed in ancient chapels, and returned with badges, blisters, and stories of divine visions that always ended with a merchant overcharging them for sacred dust. The ones who didn't return? Martyred, most likely, or robbed, or eaten by wolves. Either way, their family lit candles and said they were with the angels now. And let's not pretend the church was innocent in all this. It was a political machine. It owned land, controlled money, made alliances with kings, and condemned entire villages with a sermon. A priest could make or break a family. A bishop could end a noble house. And the Pope? The Pope was God's voice on earth, which meant arguing with him was like challenging lightning to a fistfight. Some priests were kind, devout, and humble. Others were corrupt, greedy, and more interested in wine than souls, and everyone knew. But nobody dared accuse, because to accuse the church was to accuse God, and nobody wanted to see how that went. Women had an especially complicated relationship with the church. They were praised as virgins, saints, and mothers, but always under male supervision. Nuns were respected, but restricted. They lived in convents, served through prayer and charity, and were sometimes more educated than the men who mocked them. But even they were under the authority of priests. And regular village women? Expected to obey, be pure, be quiet. Any woman with too much knowledge, too much confidence, or too much independence was suspect. If she healed the sick, she might be called a saint, or she might be burned for witchcraft. It depended on the mood of the priest and how many crops had failed that month. And fear? Fear was a daily companion, not just of hell, but of purgatory, that lovely medieval invention where you got to suffer for an unknown amount of time until God decided you were ready to move on. People bought indulgences, literal payments to the church, to reduce their time there. Couldn't afford one. Too bad. Guess your soul's taking the long road. And if you died suddenly, unconfessed, even worse. Your ghost might haunt the village, your body might be denied burial, and your family might be blamed for whatever bad luck befell the livestock that week. But through all of this, the fear, the guilt, the superstition, faith was still a light. A fragile one, yes, but real. People believed because they had to. Because the world was cruel, short, and full of loss. And the idea of eternal peace was the only thing that made the daily suffering bearable. They sang hymns not because they loved music, but because it connected them to something bigger. They knelt in muddy chapels because kneeling was sometimes the only position that didn't hurt their backs. And they prayed, endlessly, not always for miracles, but simply for the strength to survive until next week. So no, faith in the medieval world wasn't simple. It wasn't pure. It wasn't comforting in the way we like to imagine. It was messy, complicated, sometimes corrupt, sometimes beautiful. But it was everything. It was breath. It was law. It was the only thing keeping people from breaking apart under the weight of the world around them. And for many, that was enough. If you imagine childhood in a medieval village as a time of carefree innocence, of running barefoot through meadows, chasing butterflies, and falling asleep to bedtime stories under soft candlelight, forget it. Erase it completely. Because growing up in this world wasn't charming, it wasn't playful, it was dangerous, dirty, and short. If you made it to 10, you were already considered lucky. Not smart, not gifted, just lucky. Because a staggering number of children didn't. You were born into a hut shared by 7 or 8 people, none of whom had washed in a week. Your mother screamed in agony on a straw-stuffed bed, surrounded by women whose only training was watching others suffer the same way. If things went smoothly, you cried, you were wrapped in rags, and you were baptized before your third sunrise. If things didn't go smoothly, well, you probably wouldn't be given a name. Because naming a child before they survived the first month was considered a jinx, tempting fate to come back and take what it lent. Infancy was a brutal gamble. No diapers, no formula, no antibiotics. If your mother couldn't nurse and the neighbor's goat had gone dry, you were spoon-fed mashed barley soaked in water that had just been scooped from a communal puddle. You cried constantly, and nobody was surprised. You didn't sleep through the night, not because of teething, but because rats and fleas made the mattress a war zone. The only toys you had were bones, pebbles, or chunks of wood carved into vague shapes by a sibling who should have been planting turnips but wanted to make you smile. You did not learn to walk in a playpen. You learned to walk by crawling through mud, firewood, and chicken droppings while someone yelled at you to get out of the way. By the age of 3, you were no longer a baby. You were a potential worker. Girls began mimicking their mothers, helping to prepare food, clean utensils, carry water from the well. Boys followed their fathers into the fields or stables, learning the basic rule of medieval labor. If your hands aren't bleeding, you're not working hard enough. By 6, you could carry a full bucket of water, and if you spilled it, you were sent back. By 7, you were expected to help harvest grain. By 8, you might be tending sheep alone, far outside the village where wolves howled and brigands wandered. Education. For most, it simply didn't exist. There were no schools, no lessons, no chalkboards. If you were born into wealth, you might be taught Latin, arithmetic, and scripture by a tutor or priest. But if you were reading this in real life, that meant your family owned a book. And owning a book meant you were one of 10 people in a 100-mile radius who could even afford to sneeze near parchment. For peasant children, learning meant watching, mimicking, and surviving. You learned how to dig a hole without breaking your back, how to skin a rabbit without ruining the meat, how to avoid the reeve's bad side, how to tell which mushrooms wouldn't kill you and which ones made you see demons. But let's say, by miracle or favor, your village had a small chapel school. 1 room, 1 stern-faced clergyman, 1 board to write on, and a switch to whip the knuckles of any child who couldn't recite a prayer in Latin. You weren't taught to think. You were taught to repeat, memorize, obey. Education was about discipline. Boys were taught to read only enough scripture to confess properly. Girls were sometimes taught to sew, to pray, or, if the priest was progressive, to sign their name. But curiosity? That was dangerous. Asking too many questions meant you had ideas, and ideas meant pride, and pride meant the devil had taken up residence somewhere behind your left eye. Childhood games existed, but don't get too excited. They were often physical, brutal, and unsupervised. Wrestling in mud, throwing rocks at trees, chasing geese for entertainment. There were festivals where children danced, sang, and dressed up in costumes made of rags and leaves. But the line between fun and injury was thin. A scraped knee might become an infection. A broken bone was rarely treated properly. And if you got hurt badly enough to stop working for more than a day, you weren't pitied, you were a burden. Punishment was a constant reality. Obedience was enforced with beatings, shouts, or humiliation. Parents weren't gentle, not because they didn't love their children, but because the world was hard and soft children didn't survive. Boys were beaten with sticks. Girls were slapped or locked inside to reflect. Crying too much was a weakness. Talking back? A sin. And don't even think about running away. Where would you go? Every neighboring village had the same mud, the same rules, the same fear. Religion sank its teeth in early. Children were expected to attend church services, observe fast days, and memorize catechisms. They were taught that angels and demons were everywhere, that heaven awaited the obedient, that hell burned for the lazy. A child who laughed too much during Mass was suspected of impishness. One who stared too long at the altar might be accused of seeing spirits. Fear was embedded into every lesson, every story, every blessing. Even lullabies spoke of saints dying, wolves prowling, and the fires of purgatory licking the edges of disobedient dreams. And yet, through it all, children played. They laughed. They told stories. They formed crude dolls from twine and hay. They drew in dirt with sticks and gave each other wild nicknames. They chased each other between thatched roofs, dared each other to sneak into the forest, told tales of ogres and lost kings and magic wells. Hope, in its stubborn way, sprouted even in the poorest soil, because children, no matter the century, are always searching for joy, even if they have to make it from scraps. But make no mistake, childhood was not protected. There were no laws against labor, no age limits on responsibility, no counselors, no pediatricians, no therapy. Trauma was just called growing up. A child who lost a parent was expected to move on by the next planting season. A child who survived a bandit raid had nightmares, yes, but no one asked about them. Children saw death constantly, during births, plagues, executions. They watched animals slaughtered. They helped dig graves. They sang songs about famine while chewing on dry roots. And if you think parents had it easier, they didn't. Every birth was a gamble. Every cough could be fatal. Parents loved their children deeply, but they loved them with a kind of resigned intensity. The way you love something you know can be taken from you at any moment. That love didn't make them gentler. It made them desperate. Desperate to teach, to prepare, to harden their children against the coming winter, the next tax, the next war. Sentiment was not weakness, but it was dangerous. You couldn't let it paralyze you. So childhood in a medieval village wasn't a stage of life. It was a gauntlet, an audition for adulthood. And you didn't graduate with a ceremony. You survived it with scars, half your teeth, and a vague memory of a festival where you danced so hard you forgot you hadn't eaten in 2 days. And when your own child was born, you started the whole process over again, hoping that maybe, just maybe, they'd make it further than you did. So now it's the end of the day. Not just another one, but one of hundreds exactly like it. And you, this hypothetical medieval villager we've followed through blistered hands, freezing nights, endless chores, and soul-deep fear, are still alive. Barely. The sky has darkened to a thick woolen black, stars pricking through like silver threads in an old cloak. The wind has quieted, the animals are fed, the fires burn low, and you sit on your bed of straw, listening to the aching creak of the wooden beams above you and wondering, maybe aloud, maybe only in your bones, how you'll do it all again tomorrow. You are tired. Not just physically, not just in your joints or your neck or your raw, cracked fingers. You are tired in a way that reaches inside your chest and quietly wraps itself around your thoughts. Tired of the wait. Tired of the unpredictability. Tired of the silence between the moments when someone dies and the work resumes like nothing happened. Tired of the way the village never changes. The path always muddy, the chapel always watching, the fields always demanding more than you have left to give. Tired of the way your name doesn't really belong to you, but to the debt your family carries and the role you were assigned at birth. But here's the thing. You don't give up, because giving up isn't an option. It isn't even a concept. You were never taught what that meant. You survive because that's what everyone around you does. You survive because the barley won't plant itself, because the cows won't calve without help, because your children don't know yet how close the edge really is, and you need to keep it from them as long as possible. You survive because it's what your parents did, and their parents and all the parents before them, whose names are buried under the stones in the graveyard with no markers and no dates. Just the memory of someone who once turned the soil under their feet and made something grow from it. You think about what it means to be part of something larger, not a legacy, not a story worth telling, just a thread in a thick, fraying rope, the rope that holds the village together. You may never travel, you may never read a book, you may never know anything beyond the borders of your world, but you matter, not because of who you are individually, but because your hands helped shape the life around you. You tilled the fields that fed the people. You fetched the water that boiled the medicine. You stitched the clothes, sharpened the tools, carved the cradles, buried the dead. You were the rhythm, the muscle, the breath of a world that didn't know how to slow down. Outside you can hear the wind returning, soft at first like a whisper through the trees. You wrap your blanket around your shoulders, worn thin from generations of use, and you lie down on your straw mattress, the smell of earth and ash in your nose. Someone snores nearby. A baby fusses. A dog growls in its sleep. Life is happening all around you, small, rough, unrelenting. It is ugly and precious and full of moments that no one will ever record. You are part of it. You are it. The church bell might toll tomorrow for someone else, or it might toll for you. You don't know. And that's how it's always been. Life in a medieval village is not about thriving. It's not about growing rich or famous or happy. It's about continuing. Because continuing, in this time and place, is the closest thing to victory anyone will ever taste. And with that, we return to now. To here, you. Listening to this from the comfort of the present, maybe lying in bed scrolling through your feed, a soft fan humming in the background, your room bathed in artificial light, the kind that would have been considered holy magic by anyone we've talked about tonight. You're warm, you're safe, and you're connected to a past that tried to prepare you, however roughly, for the miracle of simply existing in a world where you get to choose. You get to choose what to eat, what to wear, who to love, what to learn, what to dream. And while the world still has its battles, and your life might feel overwhelming, remember, you were born in a time where hot water comes from a tap, medicine doesn't involve leeches, and no one expects you to thank a Lord before biting into your bread. If you've made it all the way to this point in the video, thank you. Really, I mean it. I don't take that lightly. These stories, this world, it's not just something I research. It's something I build because it connects us. Across time, across struggle, across everything we think separates us from the people who lived centuries ago. And if this journey spoke to you, even a little, if you felt something as you listened, maybe a pang of empathy or wonder, or even a strange affection for these impossible lives lived in impossible times, then I'd love for you to subscribe. Join this little community of history lovers, night thinkers, and quiet dreamers. It's not just about views or algorithms. It's about building a space where people can connect through story, through knowledge, through that weird shared human ache to understand where we came from. And if you're still with me, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Tell me what part of this journey struck you the most. Was it the cold winters, the relentless labor, the painful silences between generations? Or maybe the small, defiant joys, the way children still played, or how people still hoped for spring even after everything froze? Better yet, share a piece of yourself. Tell us where you're watching from, what time it is, or what kind of community you come from. Did your grandparents grow up in hardship? Do you come from a small town where everyone still knows your name? Or maybe you felt that quiet pressure of expectation, even in the modern world. This isn't just a video. It's a space for voices, yours included. Thank you for being here. Thank you for giving your time to a story about people who never had the time to tell theirs. Until next time, rest well, dream deeply, and remember, survival was always the first art form. And you, my friend, are part of its legacy.